Hello, welcome to our channel. In this video, we will talk about reflections of graphs of functions. First, let's look at this quick example. We want to graph the functions square root of negative x and negative square root of x and see how they are related. So for that, let's look at some points over here. Values of these functions for x equals 0. Maybe we can look at 1 also, negative 1. Let's look at 4 and negative 4. So when x is 0, f of x, which is square root of x, will be square root of 0. So that is 0. G of x is square root of negative x. So square root of negative 0. Negative 0 is 0. So square root of 0 is again 0. H of x is negative square root of 0. So this is also 0. When x is 1, f of x will be square root of 1, which is 1. G of x is square root of negative 1, which is not defined. H of x is negative square root of x. So negative square root of 1, which is negative 1. Now when x is negative 1, f of x will be square root of negative 1, which is not defined. G of x will be square root of negative 1, which will be square root of 1, which is 1. And h of x is negative square root of negative 1, which is again not defined. When x is 4, f of x will be square root of 4, which is 2. G of x will be square root of negative 4, which is not defined. And h of x is negative square root of 4, which is negative 2. When x is negative 4, f of x is square root of negative 4, which is not defined. G of x is square root of negative 4, which will be 2. And h of x is negative square root of negative 4, which is again not defined. So let's try to plot these points, and based on that, let's graph these functions. The first one, for f, we have 0, 0. It must go through that point. 1, 1 going through that point, and 4, 2 going through that point. So the graph of f must look like this one. So this is the graph of f. Next, let's try to draw the graph of g. When x is 0, y is 0, it must go through the origin. When x is negative 1, y is 1 over here. When x is negative 4, y is 2 over here. So the graph must look like this one. Something like this. Now let's look at function h. So we have point 0, 0 for h also. It must go through that point. Then we have 1, negative 1. 1, negative 1 is right here. It will go through that point. Then we have 4, negative 2. 4, negative 2. It will go through that point. So the graph will look like this one. This is the graph of function h. And this was function g. So looks like they are somehow related. So based on what we see here, so it looks like g and f are reflection about y-axis, and f and h are reflections about x-axis. So it looks like if we negate x or put negative sign in the front, then we get reflections about x-axis or y-axis. So basically, if we put negative sign right next to x, then we get reflection about y-axis, because we see f and g are reflections about y-axis. And if you put this negative sign all the way in the front, then we get reflections about x-axis. When the graph of f of x is reflected about x-axis, we get the graph of negative f of x. Here we have an example. We want to graph the function negative cubic root of x. So the first step is to identify the basic function. The basic function is simply the cubic root of x that has a graph like this one. So the graph of cubic root of x looks like this. Now let's identify all the transformations involved here. The only transformation I see is because of that negative in the front, which will reflect the graph of f about the x-axis when you have negative in the front. The reflection about x-axis is what we need to do over here to get the graph of negative cubic root of x. When you reflect about x-axis, this point goes down here, this point goes here, and so on. So we just reflect each point. Then the graph will look like this one. So this is the graph of negative cubic root of x. Whenever you have this negative sign all the way in front of the function, we just reflect about x-axis. Now for reflection about y-axis, we have to have that negative sign right next to x, like here. So if it's f of negative x, then we have reflection about y-axis. Here is an example. Again, let's identify the basic function. In this case, the basic function is again cubic root of x. And let's identify all the transformations we have. So the only transformation I see is that negative in front of x, and that will make it reflect about y-axis. So reflect the graph of cubic root of x about y-axis. So we start by graphing cubic root of x, which will look like this one. So this is the graph of cubic root of x. And so since we have negative x, we just reflect it about y-axis. So this point will go over here. That point will go over here. So it looks like something like this one. So when you reflect about y-axis. So this is the graph of cubic root of negative x. Here is another example. So again, the basic function here is cubic root of x. And now let's identify the transformations involved. The first transformation I see is because of that negative x, which will reflect about, when you have negative right next to x, we reflect about y-axis. The next transformation is because of that negative in the front, which will reflect about x-axis. So we start by graphing the basic function, which is cubic root of x, and that looks like this one. This is the graph of cubic root of x. And then the first transformation is to reflect about y-axis. So reflect about y-axis. That point will go over here. This point will go over here. So it will look something like this one. So this is the graph of cubic root of negative x. And the last step is to reflect about x-axis. So take this blue graph and reflect about x-axis. So basically that will then overlap with the graph we already have over here. So this will be the graph of negative cubic root of negative x. We're done with this example. Here given is the graph of f function f, and it wants us to graph function g, which is defined as f of negative x. So that negative will make it reflect about y-axis. So all we need to do is just reflect this graph about y-axis to get the graph of g. So when you reflect about y-axis, we get something like this. This is the graph of function g. Function h is negative f of x, where f is this one. So when you have negative in the front, we reflect about x-axis. So here is another example. We are given graph of f like this one, and we want to graph function g, which is defined as f of negative x. As we saw here, when that negative sign is right next to x, we are reflecting about y-axis. So the graph of g will look like this one. When you reflect graph of f about y-axis, that will give us the graph of g. And function h is negative f of x. So when you have negative all the way in the front, then we are reflecting about x-axis. So that means the graph of h will look like this one. When you reflect about x-axis, we get something like this. So this is the graph of h. Function k is negative f of negative x. So we need to do both reflection about y-axis and then reflection about x-axis. So this says reflection about y-axis, and this one says reflection about x-axis. So when you do reflection about y-axis for f, we get function g, what we have here. Now we want to take that and reflect about x-axis to get function k. So function k will look like this one. This is the graph of function k. So we are done with these examples, and this is all we have put together in this video. Thank you for watching. See you in our next videos.